A quiet cafe tilde copyright can hide the loudest truths. I learned that on a Tuesday afternoon when the woman I had once promised forever looked across the table, wrapped both hands around her untouched cup of tea, and asked the one question I had spent 7 years pretending I'd never hear again. Were you ever afraid of losing me? There are moments when time politely waits for an answer. This wasn't one of them. The silence grew heavy between us. The waitress walked by, smiled, and kept moving. A couple laughed near the window. Somewhere, a spoon clinked against porcelain. I looked at Eleanor, the woman who had once been my wife, the woman whose smile had shaped half my adulthood, and the woman I had carefully taught myself to live without. I swallowed. Always, I whispered. She searched my face, as though making sure she had heard correctly. Then I added the words that surprised even me. Even now. She blinked, and for just a second I saw the young woman I had met 22 years earlier in a church charity bookshop, standing on a ladder, trying unsuccessfully to reach the highest shelf while insisting she didn't need help. She had never liked asking for help. Apparently, neither had I. The first time I met Eleanor, she wasn't trying to impress anyone. She wore an oversized cardigan, had ink on her fingers from sorting donated books, and kept humming old hymns without realizing she was doing it. I had volunteered because my older brother insisted I needed something meaningful to do after spending every weekend working overtime. You'll either find purpose, he joked, or you'll finally make a friend. Instead, I found Eleanor. She climbed down from the ladder carrying an impossible stack of novels. The books slipped. I caught half of them before they hit the floor. She looked embarrassed. I normally don't drop things. I smiled. I normally don't catch them. She laughed. That laugh stayed with me long after the afternoon ended. Some people arrive dramatically. Others simply become part of your ordinary days until you can't remember what life felt like before they were there. Eleanor belonged to the second kind. We started having coffee after volunteer shifts. Coffee became walks. Walks became dinners. Dinners became long conversations about everything from faith to family traditions, favorite recipes, impossible dreams, and the strange comforts of ordinary routines. She believed every home should smell like fresh bread. I believed every room needed music. When we married, both dreams somehow fit under one roof. Our little house wasn't remarkable. The fence leaned slightly. The kitchen cupboard squeaked. The garden never looked as neat as Eleanor wanted because I always planted vegetables wherever there was empty space. But it was ours. Every Friday evening we cooked together. Every Sunday afternoon we visited one of our parents. Every December we wrapped gifts for families who couldn't afford Christmas presents. Life wasn't perfect. It didn't need to be. It was enough, until it slowly wasn't. People often imagine marriages ending because of one terrible event. Sometimes they do. Ours ended because of hundreds of tiny moments we never stopped to repair. I accepted more responsibility at work. She accepted leadership at the community center. Our calendars became crowded. Our conversations became practical. Did you pay the electricity bill? What time are you home? Can you collect the groceries? Don't forget your mother's birthday. Weeks became months. Months became years. We weren't angry. We were simply busy. Busy can quietly become lonely. Lonely can quietly become distance. Distance rarely announces itself. One evening Eleanor sat beside me while I answered emails. She said, "Can we talk?" Without looking up I answered, "Just 5 minutes." 5 minutes became 40. When I finally closed the laptop, she had already gone to bed. I don't remember what those emails were about. I remember that evening perfectly. There were dozens of moments like that. None seemed important alone. Together they became our story. One autumn afternoon she suggested we take a weekend away. I checked my diary. I can't. What about next month? I've got meetings. The month after? I'll probably be traveling. She smiled politely. Another time never came. Years later I realized she hadn't been asking for a holiday. She'd been asking for me. I simply hadn't understood the language. The day we decided to separate contained no shouting, no slammed doors, no cruel words, just exhaustion. We sat at the dining table where we'd celebrated birthdays, anniversaries, promotions and Christmas dinners. Neither of us cried at first. "We've become strangers," Eleanor said softly. I wanted to disagree. Instead, I looked around the room and realized I didn't know the last book she'd read. She didn't know the project keeping me awake every night. We knew schedules. We no longer knew each other. I don't know how to fix this, I admitted. She nodded. Neither do I. Sometimes honesty hurts less than pretending. We signed the papers months later. People offered advice. You'll move on. You'll meet someone else. Time heals everything, perhaps, but time doesn't erase gratitude. It simply teaches you to carry it differently. After the divorce, I moved into a smaller cottage on the edge of town. I planted tomatoes. She always said tomatoes tasted better when grown with patience. I still made too much soup. I still bought her favorite tea by accident. I still caught myself reaching for my phone whenever something funny happened. Then I'd remember. Some habits outlive relationships. Years passed. Life continued. I became involved with mentoring young apprentices at work. Eleanor expanded the community center into something remarkable. We occasionally crossed paths during charity events. We smiled. We were kind. We stayed careful. People assumed we'd stopped loving each other because we'd stopped being married. Life isn't always that simple. Love changes shape. Sometimes it becomes friendship. Sometimes gratitude, sometimes quiet respect, sometimes an ache you learn to live beside. One Saturday morning our mutual friend Margaret invited several volunteers to repaint the village hall. Neither Eleanor nor I knew the other would be there. She arrived carrying paintbrushes. I arrived carrying ladders. We looked at each other, then laughed. Still carrying too much? She asked. Only the heavy things. She raised an eyebrow. I remember. The day felt strangely comfortable. We worked alongside retired teachers, university students, mechanics, nurses and shopkeepers. Everyone wore old clothes. Everyone ended the afternoon covered in paint. Someone turned on old music. Margaret insisted everyone dance while waiting for lunch. Even Eleanor. She rolled her eyes. I haven't danced in years. You survived before? I said. You'll survive again. She laughed. We danced for exactly one song. Nothing more, nothing less. Some memories don't reopen wounds. They remind you healing happened. After that day, seeing one another became easier. Occasionally we'd exchange gardening advice, sometimes recipes, sometimes recommendations for books. Never expectations, never regrets, until the phone call. It came on a Thursday evening. Eleanor, her voice sounded uncertain. I hope I'm not interrupting. Not at all. There was a pause. My father passed away this morning. I closed my eyes. Arthur had been one of the gentlest men I'd ever known. He'd taught me how to repair a wooden gate. He'd insisted tea solved almost every problem. He'd hugged me after the divorce and whispered, "Family doesn't disappear just because paperwork changes." "I'm so sorry," I said. "I know." Another silence. I wondered. "You don't have to ask." She exhaled slowly. "I'd appreciate it if you came to the service." "I'll be there." Funerals have a way of reminding people what truly lasts. Arthur's church overflowed with neighbors whose fences he'd repaired, children he'd coached, widows he'd visited, and strangers he'd quietly helped without ever mentioning it. The minister spoke about ordinary kindness, about consistency, about showing up. I kept thinking Arthur would have laughed at all the attention. After the service Eleanor found me standing beside the garden. "Thank you for coming. I couldn't imagine not being here." She looked tired. "Would you mind helping Mum sort through Dad's workshop next week?" Of course. Arthur's workshop smelled exactly as I remembered. Fresh timber, machine oil, peppermint sweets. Everything had its place. Even the screws were organized into labeled jars. Eleanor smiled sadly. He labeled everything, so no one would waste time searching. We spent hours packing tools, sharing stories, laughing more than crying. Her mother, Grace, watched us from the doorway. "You two still work well together." Neither of us answered. Perhaps because she was right. Weeks later Grace invited us both for Sunday lunch. Then Christmas. Then Easter. No one discussed whether it was unusual. It simply felt natural. Family had quietly chosen compassion over awkwardness. One evening after dinner Grace handed us a small wooden box. Arthur's handwriting covered the lid. "For difficult days." Inside were folded notes. One for Eleanor, one for me. Mine read, "Daniel, if you're reading this, I'm probably with the Lord already. I was never proud that your marriage ended. But I never stopped being proud of the man you became. Remember this, success is measured by the number of hearts you've cared for, not the number of achievements you've collected. Don't waste years hiding gratitude because you're afraid people will misunderstand it. Life is shorter than pride. I folded the letter carefully. Arthur somehow always knew exactly what needed saying. Months passed. Our friendship slowly deepened, not romantically, not intentionally, simply honestly. We talked about books again, gardening, church projects, neighbors, life. One afternoon Eleanor admitted something. I almost didn't call you when Dad died. Why? I thought it might be unfair. To who? To both of us. I'm glad you did. So am I. We began volunteering together once more. Nothing forced, nothing assumed. Just two people discovering they had always made a good team when the goal wasn't proving anything. One winter the community center launched a program pairing retired craftspeople with young adults seeking practical skills. I offered woodworking classes. Eleanor coordinated volunteers. Watching teenagers build their first bookshelves reminded me of Arthur. Patient guidance, gentle encouragement, celebrating progress instead of perfection. One boy named Oliver struggled every week. Nothing fit properly, measurements were wrong. His confidence disappeared. One evening he sighed, "I'm just rubbish at this." Before I could answer, Eleanor knelt beside him. She placed the crooked piece of wood on the bench. "This isn't failure, it's information." He frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means now you know one way that doesn't work." She smiled warmly. "People aren't measured by their mistakes, they're measured by what they do next." Oliver stayed. Months later he built the best cabinet in the class. Watching him smile reminded me how often hope arrives disguised as patience. Life settled into a rhythm neither of us expected. Friends occasionally asked uncomfortable questions. "Are you getting back together?" We'd exchange amused glances. "We're just friends." Mostly that was true, but friendship built on years of shared history carries unusual depth. It wasn't about starting over. It was about finally learning how to care for each other without trying to control the future. Then came the Cafe Tilde copyright, the same Cafe Tilde copyright where we'd once celebrated our 10th anniversary, the same Cafe Tilde copyright where she now sat stirring untouched tea. She had invited me without explaining why. After asking if I'd ever feared losing her, she waited quietly for my answer. "Always." Even now, tears gathered in her eyes. "I spent years believing you weren't afraid at all." I was terrified. "Then why didn't you say anything?" "Because I thought love was demonstrated through working harder, providing more, solving bigger problems, being dependable." I smiled sadly. I confused responsibility with presence. She looked down. I did too. The afternoon sun drifted across the table. Neither of us hurried. "I thought," she said softly, "that if I asked for more attention, I'd sound selfish. I thought if I kept working harder, you'd feel more secure." We were both trying to protect each other, and accidentally creating distance. She laughed through tears. "We really were foolish. We were inexperienced." "No," she smiled gently. "We were human." I nodded. "That's probably more accurate." She reached into her handbag and removed a faded photograph. It showed us outside the bookshop where we'd first met. We were impossibly young. My tie was crooked. She still had ink on her fingers. "I found this while clearing Mom's loft. It's a good picture. It's my favorite." I looked at it for a long moment. We looked hopeful. We were, and maybe we still are. She looked surprised. "You think so?" "I think hope doesn't always look like getting everything back. Sometimes it looks like appreciating what remains." She smiled. "I like that." Over the following months nothing dramatic happened. No grand declarations, no cinematic moments, just conversations, meals with friends, volunteer projects, helping neighbors, living honestly. One afternoon Margaret cornered me while arranging flowers for the church hall. "Can I ask something?" "You usually do." She laughed. "Are you and Eleanor happy?" I thought carefully. "I think we're becoming peaceful." "That's different." "It is. Better, in many ways." She nodded thoughtfully. "I've learned peace lasts longer than excitement." So had I. Nearly a year later our community center celebrated its 20th anniversary. Hundreds attended. Families, former volunteers, young adults whose lives had quietly changed because someone believed in them. Oliver displayed the cabinet he'd built. Grace served homemade pies. Music filled the hall. Near the end of the evening the organizer invited several longtime volunteers onto the stage. Eleanor and I stood side by side. The organizer thanked everyone for decades of service before asking each person to share one lesson life had taught them. When my turn came, I looked across the room. I used to believe people lose one another suddenly. I smiled gently. Now I think most relationships are strengthened or weakened in very small moments. The conversation we postpone, the gratitude we forget to express, the kindness we assume can wait until tomorrow. I glanced at Eleanor. If someone matters to you, don't let busyness speak louder than affection. The room fell quiet. Then came warm applause. Later, as guests slowly left, Eleanor found me stacking chairs. You've always stacked chairs after events. I know, you still don't let anyone help. I handed her half the pile. I'm learning. She laughed. So you are. Outside, the evening air felt calm. Families drove home. Lights glowed through nearby windows. Life carried on exactly as it always had. Eleanor looked toward the stars beginning to appear. Do you ever wish we'd known then what we know now? Of course. She smiled sadly. So do I. But then again, what if we'd never made mistakes? Perhaps we wouldn't appreciate grace nearly as much. She nodded slowly. I think Dad would have liked that answer. I think he would have corrected my grammar. She laughed louder than I had heard in years. That sound felt like healing, not because it promised another beginning, because it proved joy could survive disappointment. A few weeks later I received a handwritten note in my letterbox. It wasn't signed. It didn't need to be. It simply read, "Thank you for never pretending our years together meant nothing. Thank you for choosing kindness over bitterness. Whatever the future holds, I'm grateful we remembered how to be good to one another." I placed the note inside Arthur's wooden box. Some things deserve careful keeping. Today, people occasionally see Eleanor and me sharing coffee after volunteer meetings. Some assume we're husband and wife. Others assume we're old friends. Neither explanation fully captures the truth. We are two imperfect people who learn that love isn't only measured by whether relationships last forever. Sometimes it's measured by the respect that remains after dreams change, by forgiveness offered without conditions, by showing up when someone needs you, even when you no longer have to. And every now and then, when we sit quietly in that little cafe copyright, she catches me smiling at nothing in particular. What are you thinking? She asks. I usually answer honestly. I'm grateful, because life gave us two chances. The first taught us how to love. The second taught us how to love wisely. If there's one lesson our story leaves behind, it's this: never assume the people you cherish already know what is in your heart. Speak your gratitude while there is still time. Choose presence over distraction, kindness over pride, and forgiveness over resentment. Relationships may change, seasons may pass, and life may unfold differently than you imagined, but a heart that continues to care with honesty and compassion never truly loses what mattered most. In the end, the greatest legacy we leave is not perfection, but the quiet love we consistently choose to give.